first one here because I want to go on to the next slide. Because I want to start with a brief story as we're going to talk about followership here. So one afternoon in Texas, a little town called Coleman, Texas, there was once a family. They were sitting on their porch playing dominoes, and the father-in-law said, "Why don't we take a trip up to Abilene? It's been a long time since I've been to Abilene." It's about 50 some odd miles away up to Abilene, but he wants to go for dinner, and the wife says, "Sounds like a great idea." And the husband who suggested, why don't maybe had some reservations with it, said, "Well, it sounds good to me. I just hope everybody else wants to go." And so, the husband, the wife, the father-in-law, mother-in-law are all happy in there. They're going to go and they're going to get on the road to Abilene for dinner. And so the drive up to Abilene, about 50 miles from this little town called Coleman, Texas, was a hot, dusty drive. No one was really fond of it. They got to a little cafeteria up in Abilene, and the food was just about as bad as the drive. Nobody really cared for it much. And then they get back home probably about 4 hours after they said, "Well, let's go up to Abilene for dinner." And everyone's exhausted and tired. And one of them in the group sort of dishonestly says, "Well, that was a great trip, wasn't it?" And the mother-in-law chimes in with a, "Well, actually, I would have been fine if we had just stayed home, but I went along because everybody else wanted to." Then the husband said, "Well, I wasn't delighted to be doing what we were doing. I just figured everybody else wanted to go along." And the wife says, "Well, I just went along to keep you happy." And then the father-in-law who suggested it said, "I only suggested it because I thought the others might be bored." So at that point, the whole group has to sit back and realize that they took a trip up to Abilene that nobody particularly wanted to take, when they each would have preferred if they just could have sat comfortably at their own porch and had dinner at home. It's called the Abilene paradox. I didn't actually just make up that story. I wish I were that good at the storytelling, except I clearly wasn't because I was stumbling over the words as I tried to say them. But the Abilene paradox refers to an idea that sometimes folks may have an idea that nobody really is that passionate about it, and nobody even really thinks it's a good idea. But everybody just kind of goes along with it. There's never anyone who can stand up and say, "Well, do we really want to go to Abilene for dinner? Really, do you want to go to Abilene for dinner? It's a long, dusty drive. Is that a place where we want to go?" Nobody was really that interested in it, which makes it different than the idea of groupthink, where folks can actually get really psyched up to say, "Oh yeah, this is a great idea. We're definitely going to do this. We're going to move forward with it." But sometimes you realize even when folks all know they don't want to do it, you can still have that happen. We'll go on to the next slide here, and I think we're going to run through these a little bit easier. So why do we need followers? Well, on one hand, it's going to help prevent that Abilene paradox, where you wind up all just going along and doing something because you realize that you don't want to say no, and you kind of assume everybody wants to do it, but nobody actually knows that they want to do it. It can also help prevent groupthink, which is the idea of everybody just getting psyched around one particular idea and saying, "Yes, this is definitely what we need to do." But in the chapter setting, and this is something that we talked about with the brothers a little bit earlier today, a chapter is a very flat organization. When you are sitting together in a chapter setting, you're probably in a circle or arcs or some variation of that. And organizations all across the country are increasingly flat in their nature, where you find yourself working in teams that you are peers with, where maybe you don't necessarily have someone that you are over supervising, or maybe even when you do have a supervisor, you've still got a good team that's working together on those projects. So in those cases, having talented followers becomes even more important, because simply being a leader and being the one out in front in that case doesn't mean as much, because who is the person out in front? There's no one who is granted or bestowed that positional leadership in many instances. Not everybody can lead simultaneously, so you need followers in that sense too. Even when you do have a leader, when you acknowledge this person is the leader of the group, I imagine everybody in this group has been a leader at some point in time, because you are in Tau Beta Sigma or Kappa Kappa Psi. I mean, by very nature, leadership is something that you're at least familiar with and that you've done. So you can't necessarily be doing it all the time. And so you need effective followership to help strengthen organization. So we'll go on to the next slide here. And I want to talk about its importance to chapters a little bit. And this is a callback to the workshop I just did with the brothers. If you don't have any followers, your chapter is gonna die. Because you will never have a chance to pass on whatever wisdom you've learned, whatever you may have earned and gotten as a chapter. If you don't have anybody to pass that on to, if you don't have a next generation of leaders, then you're in trouble. You know, one of my biggest regrets and things that bugs me the most is that when I was an active brother of our chapter, I led up our ritual team. And it pained me, and I realized that this was a failing, that 2 years after I had left the chapter and was no longer inactive, the current ritual chair called me up and said, hey, what's the combination to the locker where all of our supplies are? Clearly, somebody didn't do a good job of developing followers who knew the plan of action and who knew how to take on that task, that simple task of unlocking a cabinet after I had left. So, if you want your chapter to outlive you, then you have to have followers. You have to build them up. It'll help you be more successful yourself because you'll be able to delegate. You'll be able to find folks who can gradually build their own competencies and can develop leadership capabilities. And it's going to ease those transitions. It's going to make the process of keeping a chapter running a lot smoother in the future than it would be if you just say, well, this is the group of folks we have now, and we're going to do this how we're going to do it today. This is how we've always done it. We're going to keep doing it this way, and then we're going to move forward. That's not a recipe for great chapters. That's a recipe for stagnant chapters that lose membership because you don't invest in developing followers in your group as well as leaders. So let's go on to the next slide here. What is a follower? So this is a very simple definition that I was able to find from 2008. I'm not a big fan of this definition. But it says followers are subordinates who have less power, authority, and influence than do their superiors, and who therefore usually but not invariably fall into line. That's not a very good definition to me. What do y'all think a follower is? Somebody.
I feel like followers are more like a supporter. They're not there to just fall into line, but they're there to support and to, in chapter setting, they're there to help their committee or to help the chapter whole, but not necessarily there to just fall in line and do what they're told to do.
Okay. So not someone who falls in line necessarily, but someone who supports. Yeah. Okay.
I feel that in a way followers in themselves are leaders in a way, because if you have one person that wants change, they can be a leader, but if nobody else wants the change, then nothing's going to happen. Whereas if you have that very first follower step up and say, hey, I want this change too, then in that itself, they're in a way being a leader.
Mm-hmm. The leader is just someone with crazy ideas until somebody follows. Then they become a leader.
I don't like the part where it says they have less influence, because I feel like followers are just as much contributors as the leaders. And if you just are doing, if you're just under the influence of the leader, it's just one person's idea and it might not be like inclusive or the best way to go about a situation.
Yeah, absolutely. I 100% agree with you on that. And that's going to be something we're going to talk about in a little bit, is the fact that followers are not folks without influence. They have a lot of influence. Anybody else want to talk about what a follower is?
So like a good leader isn't someone that's in power necessarily. The followers are equals.
Okay. Yep, so recognizing that you've got a whole team of folks who are working together on a mission rather than just saying, I'm the leader and everybody else is supporting me. It's we're all working together on something. Good.
I think that followers are like the foundation of an organization, because kind of as like a move people have already said, like you can't have a leader who just has those ideas like without followers to support them and back them up, and to like encourage or even discourage them. So I think that I think that like followers definitely make like a foundation for that organization.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Followers are future leaders. If you are following the right leadership, then you will get more leadership and more followers, and then more leadership and more followers. That's how it's supposed to work. Like, you're not going to be a follower. Some people might be a follower per se their whole life, but they'll take on leadership positions some way or another. Like, maybe you follow someone around when you were a baby in a chapter, but like by the time you're a senior, people are following you around. Like, the goal is that one day you're gonna be the leader and you follow in that person's footsteps more than just like follow in a line.
Absolutely. And I think that works great in chapters especially, because everybody is definitely there for only a fixed amount of time. When you graduate, you leave the chapter. Unless you happen to go to grad school, then maybe you get a couple more years. But, you know, and this is something that I love as an alum of the fraternity, is that we spend a whole lot more time in alumni status, hopefully, than we spend in active status. So if everybody is like that, then there constantly is a need for new leaders. And I'll even, you know, expand on that further and say that a follower may not be the leader, but if you're an effective follower, you are a leader. There really is not as big of a difference between those two terms as we may want to think that there is. Because organizations today are not necessarily structured like the military, where you've got a general who is over colonels, who are then over sergeants, and it's not, you know, in very few organizations do you see that degree of regimented structure of you report to this person, who reports to that person, who reports to that person. A lot of the time you're in a mixture of teams and organizations where you're working together, and even though you may not be the leader tasked on a project, you still have influence. You still have the ability to persuade and be a leader if you're an effective follower. So let's go to the next slide. What are effective followers? How does one become an effective follower? Well, I would say that an effective follower needs to be able to manage themselves well. And this is not me, I should clarify. This comes from literature that's been done in the social sciences on followership. It's actually a thing that people have studied, which is kind of cool. So an effective follower would be able to manage themselves well. They'll, you know, be in control of themselves. They'll be able to say, this is what I believe, this is what I want to do. And they're going to be an independent, critical thinker. So an effective follower is definitely going to be committed to the organization. You can't be an effective follower if you just don't really care. It's like, oh, sisterhood, brotherhood, yay, I can take it or leave it. You're not going to be an effective follower if that's your motto, if that's where you're coming from. So you have to have that commitment and that dedication. You're going to be someone who focuses on doing your own hard work and building your own levels of competence within the organization. You're going to develop yourself and take interest and ownership in becoming a better follower, a better participant, and a better leader. That's why I think all of y'all are here today. It's something that you care about and that you want to do, is develop yourselves as more effective leaders in the brotherhood or sisterhood. And then an effective follower is going to be themselves courageous, honest, and credible. So are those traits that we don't want our leaders to have also? Or are those also good leadership traits by and large? I would argue that they are pretty similar. So let's go to the next slide here. So this guy, Robert Kelly, and he did this work way back in 1988, which, believe it or not, was before even I was born. So that tells you how far back this idea of followership goes. But it's a great theory in that it really is a simple way of looking at folks and saying, well, are you going to be an effective follower or whatnot? It looks at two key dimensions. Are you able to be a critical thinker? And are you able to participate in an organization? So let's go to the next slide here. And if we think of this as a typical XY axis here, where up is high and right is high and left and down low is low. So what do we think this person is like? They are low on critical thinking and they're low on participation. How would you describe that person?
They're the person that sits in the back of the room and just kind of like, okay.
Mm-hmm, okay.
Um,
Yeah, go ahead.
They probably already met brother or sister because they probably don't want to put in the effort.
Yeah, they may not even be in this room because they may not even have decided, yes, I want to join a service organization. They may not have even gotten that far. But let's say, even if they have, do you recognize someone who might be like this in your chapters? I hope not, but there probably are at least a few folks. Anybody, any other thoughts on what this follower may look like? Well, if we go to the next slide, then we'll see that Kelly himself has a very not friendly term for those folks. He just calls them sheep. They're going to follow, they're going to just go along, but they aren't going to think about why they're doing it. They aren't going to, ask any questions. They're just going to say, yeah, sure, whatever, and then they may or may not show up. Because if you aren't participating and you don't really think about what's going on, why are you even in the room? I would trust that most of us who want to be effective followers are going to look for something that's different than that, where we're going to want to be involved, we're going to want to be participating. So that's one corner of this. So let's say you find someone who doesn't necessarily think critically about things, but they do participate, they do show up. What does that person look like?
I think they're like very comfortable with like the status quo and stuff, and like they'll just kind of like go along with the flow. Like they are being active, they're not just being passive, but like they're not trying to like strive for improvement or trying to find ways to make themselves better. They just want to do what they're told.
Okay. Let's see. Here we go.
I guess this kind of seems like the kind of person where they'll be like ready to be told what to do, but they won't necessarily actively seek what to do.
Okay.
I feel like these are kind of like the worker bees, where they get the job done, but they might be kind of like more like sponge type personalities, where it's like they maybe later want to start like critically thinking for themselves, but right now they're just taking it all in and they're learning, and they're not ready to like start their own like to-do lists yet.
Yeah, I think that's all fair. Yeah, and so there are definitely ways to be more effective and less. Not everybody's going to start off as a truly effective follower from day one, especially if you are new in an organization. You may want to learn, how does this group work? How does this group operate? What can I learn to be more effective? So let's go to the next slide here, and we'll wrap up that. So Kelly calls these folks the yes men in the crowd. The folks who say, yep, that sounds like a great idea. We're all on board with it. Let's go do it. These are the folks who maybe are eating dinner in Abilene right now because they didn't think about why. They just went ahead and said, oh, yep, somebody suggested it. Sounds good. And these may be the folks that if you get too much of them riled up in the wrong direction, if you don't have an effective leader, then your chapter may struggle somewhat because you may find yourself saying, oh, yeah, that sounds like a great idea. When in fact it may not necessarily be a good idea. My worst example of this from my time as an active is we had an annual musical performance that we would do. We called it our Spring Musicale. And one year we had folks who had the great idea of, well, we're just so busy, we'll cancel our musicale. And I wanted to be an effective follower, and I've been saying, we're kind of a musical fraternity. Why are we canceling our musicale performance? Why is that the thing that we're going to sacrifice as part of this? But it was too late because everybody said, oh yeah, no, it's a good idea, I'm too busy, just cancel the musical stuff and we'll keep going forward. That's one of those things where sometimes if somebody comes up with a bad idea, if there are some ideas that may not be truly reflective of where the organization wants to go, you can find yourself getting into a little bit of trouble from time to time. You can find yourself straying from that pathway that you want to go along as part of an effective organization. And that can be an inhibitor to really having a great chapter. So that's one thing we might see. Now let's talk about these folks. High on critical thinking, low on participation. I know some folks who are like this in my chapter. Anybody else?
It seems like the kind of people who are very eager to raise issues about things in the chapter, but will never do anything about them.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Anybody else?
I feel like if these people do achieve like a position, then they could have more of like a dictator style of like, I know the things that we should do, so you guys do them. And then they kind of like sit and watch.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so not effective leaders if they do wind up in a leadership role. Mm-hmm.
I think these are the people that kind of just like to argue about like little things like dictation or words and like a change to the Constitution or something. Like they're focused on minute details.
Mhm.
Perfect.
Yep.
These are, I think, at least in our chapter, they're like the old people who have like they've been through a lot of experiences, but then they like sit back and say, I've done my time, I've put in my work, and I really don't want to help move this forward. I'm just gonna complain about it.
It always is the old people, isn't it? And I hate it. All right, what else?
I'm sorry.
Let's focus.
Like bringing up ideas, like they can be super excited about, oh, we should do this as a chapter, that as a chapter, but then not following through on their own ideas. And that, you know, it looks great to the chapter, but then if it doesn't work out, then it just falls flat. So
Mm-hmm.
kind of people who like bait delegate, like, so like, this is what I'm gonna do, and I'm just gonna give it all to you guys, and then that's it. I'm not gonna do anything. So they like delegate, but it's not working.
Yeah. Okay, so let's go to the next slide here and then let's talk about these folks a little bit more. So, Kelly calls these folks the alienated. They may be in the chapter, they may be sitting in the room with you. There's generally a corner of them, they generally all sit together, just from my experience. It typically is the older folks in the chapter. And I would call them stone throwers in a sense. Saying, yeah, no, that's a terrible idea. We didn't do that in the past. Why are we doing that now? Why are we changing? And so they are thinking critically about the issues. They're thinking critically about, well, why are we doing this versus something else? But to a certain extent, there may have been a failure of them to engage. On one hand, where they may say, I don't like whatever they're doing, I'm just not going to show up. Which is a really sad way that I've seen a lot of older folks exit a chapter. They just gradually become more and more disaffected over time. They say, it's changing, it's not what I wanted to do. They don't listen to my ideas, they don't care about my ideas. I'm just gonna not show up to stuff anymore. And they just kind of head out. This group can also continue to stick around and can, rear their head at just some of the worst times to really cause a stink from time to time. But it's not necessarily a group of folks who couldn't be persuaded. But to a certain extent, though, if they don't show up, if they aren't in the room, if they aren't actually contributing to the discussion and saying why they feel a certain way, if they're just really saying, I don't like it, and then complaining without bringing a solution to the table, that's where you can wind up getting into some issues. This is a group that has a lot of potential if you're able to reach out to them, if you're able to bring them back into the fold of the sisterhood or the fold of the brotherhood. You can have a great discussion with these folks, and sometimes you can help encourage them to greater heights. You can encourage them to become more effective in their participation. But that has to be a decision that they make to be an effective follower. Because otherwise, if they choose to use that critical thinking but not participate, then they're stuck on the sidelines and they're stuck being alienated going forward into the future. So what would we call somebody in the middle of this chart? I threw a curveball. Weren't expecting I was going to put something right in the middle of the chart. How would we describe those folks?
I think being like especially looking at the streams, I think they're still pretty high achieving because they do have a combination of both. While they might not be like the superstars who are going to the extremes of both ends of the scale, they are still making sure that they combine both their critical thinking with participation and still getting stuff done and still trying to improve chapter and stuff. So, yeah.
Okay, definitely. Other thoughts? Folks in the middle.
I would say they're probably some of
Okay. Yep. Probably gonna participate. Probably gonna have some good ideas. Did you have something to add?
Yeah, just like as a follower, I think that those are the people that like, oh my god, I forgot where I was gonna go with this. Those are the people that like are like the drive of the chapter, I think, because if they're not in like, you know, a position of leadership, then they still have the chapter's best interest in mind and they're willing to put in that work to make those things happen. So I think that they bring a lot to the table.
Okay. Did you have a thought also?
Yeah, I mean, they're the people in the middle, and that's kind of what they are in the chapter as well, is they're like the brothers that show up to meeting and that show up to like half of the events or most of the events, and you know, they may not hold leadership positions, but they're still just as important. They make up the majority.
That's a great point. So click on the next slide here. They do frequently make up the majority. A lot of folks fall into this middle ground. Kelly calls them pragmatic survivors. If you were in the last workshop of the brothers in here, I would call them Aaron Burr. They're content to wait for it. They're content to see which way the wind's going to blow. And they might tag along, they might not. They become a core group that if you want to be successful in a chapter type setting, if you want to say, hey, this is what we need to do, let's go do it, you've got to encourage those folks. Because they may not necessarily be all the way out on any one side. They may not necessarily be the person coming to the table with a ton of great ideas all the time. They may not be participating all the time, but they still have buy-in. They still want to do something. They're still there for a reason. They are looking out for their own best interests, though, and they don't want to be on the unpopular side of an issue. Most folks don't want to be on the unpopular side of the issue. That's just as a general rule. We like having folks agree with us. We like thinking that folks think like us. That's how we get some of these things, like the Abilene paradox and the idea of groupthink, because we like to be on sort of the same page with folks. So this is a very common group, but they are still, in a certain extent, waiting to see which way things are going to go. They may not necessarily be coming with the ideas, which makes them not the most effective type of follower that you have. So, spoiler alert on the last one, what do you think is someone who has high levels of participation and thinks critically? Yeah, you could say that. More appropriately, they're just good, effective followers. If we go to the next slide, that's actually what Kelly calls them. They calls them the star followers. If you want somebody to be really good and really successful, they are going to be both a critical thinker, but they're also going to be someone who is always in the room. It doesn't matter if you are the leader in a chapter or not. You may not be on the exec board. But if you're always there, if you're always being a positive representation of your chapter, of your organization on campus, then that's one thing that really makes you a star follower. And most specifically, in that process of being there, of being present, of being a good representative, you're going to think about the issues. You're going to be willing to say, why are we making this decision? And that means you're going to be willing to sometimes be the unpopular person in the room. I was not a popular person when I said, yeah, why are we canceling the music out? We should not be doing this. This is a bad idea. I was not the popular person in the room, and they decided not to, go forward with it, and they still canceled it. We didn't do the show that year. But if you want to be truly effective, you're going to have to think critically. And I would say you think critically in the context of the, values that we have as an organization, be it the fraternity or the sorority. The values themselves are not that drastically different. We value doing good for our bands. We value being good representatives on campus. We value leadership. We value music and the arts. These are things that we value. We value sisterhood and brotherhood. Those are not necessarily controversial things to say, but it's important to think through the actions that you're going to be taking as a chapter within that context. And if you want to get even more specific, think through it in the context of what you learn within the ritual, because that's really where we derive our meaning of what it means to be a sister or a brother is from those texts that have been passed down to us to say, this is what our organization is all about. Let's go on to the next slide here. So, with all of that in mind, you may be asking this question. So, sure, I can be an effective follower. Does that really make me a leader? Or does it make me just a random person out there with sometimes crazy thoughts who does show up and I do my part, but I'm not really a leader? Possible. Let's talk more about this. So, next slide here. I want to talk a little bit about power. And I know power is a word that sometimes can have some negative connotations to it. But really, power is a way to help get things done. And when you look at how you accomplish something, there are ways that you can exercise power. On one hand, it can come from a very positional sense of saying, I am the president of this organization, and therefore I decree that we are going to do these things. And in some instances, that can be powerful. There is a power that comes legitimately from having a position, having a title of leadership. Because whenever somebody is going to talk to the organization, whenever they're going to look for someone to speak on your chapter's behalf, I would reach out to the chapter president. That just kind of makes sense. That's a power that comes from having a title. There's a power that comes from reward and coercion, the ability to either give people what they do want or give people what they don't want. That is a power that leaders sometimes have by virtue of their title. And your chapter's constitution may spell that out. It may say the president can appoint chairs of committees, for example. Very common thing that presidents can do. So they can have types of power like that. And sometimes they'll have information power, where they'll be able to say, well, I know these things, and because I know this, that's why this is the course of action that we need to take. But there are a lot of ways that you can also have personal power. So if maybe only someone who is the leader or one of the leaders within an organization has that type of positional power, anybody can have personal power. What is personal power? It means that folks will defer to you and they appreciate you. When I was finally around older in the chapter, I was one of the old folks, and folks liked me. I hope. I don't know. Maybe they all hated me. I think they tended to like me. And if folks like you, that's a type of power, believe it or not, because that's something that can help you persuade folks. That's all it is being able to say, well, I want you to do this, or I think that this is a good idea. It's all about persuasion, nothing more, nothing less. Being an expert on something. We were talking earlier today about how a service project might be cleaning and polishing the brass instruments. Well, if somebody is an expert on brass instruments, little old me here who plays the saxophone is going to defer to them on how to polish the bell of the baritone. I don't know how to do that. I'm going to defer to them. They're an expert. They're an expert on that. They have power in a sense because I'm going to defer to them on how to do something. Sometimes it's just charisma. Anybody can be charismatic. You can come in with energy and passion and enthusiasm and say, this is how we're going to do this, and I am so excited, and this is why we should do it, and we're going to be great. Anybody can exercise charisma. You don't just have to be the leader to have that. And same with rational basis. Anybody can make a good argument. You can say, if we do these things, we'll be successful. And here's my argument as to why. See these 5 bullet points under reasons X, Y, and Z, and here's my full case. Anybody can do that. So let's go on to the next slide here. I think we've got one more. So anybody can exercise that type of power. And I think this basically summarizes what I just said. Anybody can be inspiration. Anybody can be someone who draws people in on the basis of who they are, what they do, and why they do it. Being an effective follower is just that. It's being able to say to folks, hey, this is why I think that we should be doing this. I'm exercising my own critical thinking skills in this regard. And because of that, it can increase how folks view you. They can view you as a leader or as at least someone who is a star follower within the organization. And with that actually comes the same type of power that a leader or the leader might have. Because that's all it is. It's about being able to persuade people to reach greater heights, to say, together, we're going to be great. We're not going to be satisfied with the status quo. We're going to strive for something greater and something better. That's all it really is. Yes, only some folks may have the title, but that doesn't stop anybody from being a great follower, which is the same thing as being a good leader in many instances. So let's go on to the next slide here. And I think this is where we've got, I'm going to get a little personal and tell my story, how I got here today. So I was initiated about 10 years ago, and all I had to do and all I had to learn then was to buy into the vision and who we are. And quickly after that, it's like, okay, well, if we're a service organization, I'm going to be a good servant. I'm going to be doing service. I'm going to do all the things that a good brother is supposed to do with service and stuff like that. And anybody can do that at any point in time. Doesn't matter how old or young you are. Doesn't matter how much experience you've got. Anybody can be present and be in the room. That's your first simple thing that anybody can do. Later on, I became a big brother. And this is where I started having some issues because the person in that picture who is my little didn't make it through process. She was the first person voted out by the chapter that semester. And it became a challenge for me at a very young age in the brotherhood, only a year in, to use my own critical thinking and to embrace that and develop it and say, okay, well, why did the chapter make a decision that I obviously didn't like because this is my little? Why is that what happened? Why as a chapter are we making these decisions? What is our basis for it? Are we basing our decisions based off of our values, our vision? Are we basing it off of ideas that maybe do align with it or don't align with that? And this semester I became a little bit of a thorn in the side of our chapter president at the time because I was going to say, well, it's great if we're going to hold our membership candidates to a high standard, but are we going to hold ourselves to a high standard also? We weren't necessarily doing that at the time because we had no policies in place for attendance. We had folks coming to vote on people who they'd never met. But they were active, they were brothers, but they didn't show up for any service projects. They didn't do any of the other things that you would expect a brother in good standing would be doing. So it allowed me to start thinking critically. And that was something that allowed me, I think, to be successful in my chapter. I don't know if I would have been as successful if I hadn't been able to think critically and think about why and how we got to where we are. So go on the next slide here and I'll talk a little bit more. I did become a big brother again, fortunately, and my wonderful little, the second time, did make it through process, which was very happy for me. And I made sure that no matter where I was, I tried to stay involved. So the semester after that, I went conditional because I was in Washington, D.C. at the time. But I was still trying to be involved and in the room. I was still trying to be a participant, whether I was there or not. So at NatCon of 2011, those are three of my brothers there. We were finalists for the Scroggs Trophy that year. And virtually while I was in DC, I was helping them prepare the documents that they needed to submit. And I was being a participant in that process. So one of those phones there I'm on the other end of because I was working my summer job and couldn't get all the way out to Colorado Springs. So there are a lot of ways that you can remain present and you can remain a part of your chapter, whether you're in the room or not. You can still be a leader. And part of that means if you're going to be an effective follower, you bring other folks on as followers. You start building those friendships, you start recruiting folks who you believe can make a positive impact on your chapter, who can make your chapter successful. The gentleman next to me in that picture was a freshman, so he was 1 year younger than me when I was a sophomore. He credits me for recruiting him into the Brotherhood. I don't even know what I did. But he became a drum major the next year and a chapter president his senior year. And it's all about seeing potential in folks, reaching out to them and recruiting them, and trying to build up that base of other people, getting the right people on the bus, as we talked about earlier with the brothers, about being able to lead effectively and get a good group together. Next slide. So then after that, I decided, well, I'm going to run for an actual office. Throughout all of this time, I'd never been elected officer in my chapter. I did run for vice president of membership, which was the one position that was actually an open position going into my senior year. And I lost. That's okay, there were a bunch of folks running for it. I knew I wasn't the best person for that position. So I decided, well, you know what I'll do? I will run for district office, because at that point I decided I'm going to be in grad school. So I can keep helping to serve the district. So I went down to SED Convention 2012, ran for district president, and I lost. I wasn't even slated to be president. And the person that they slated was actually going to be running for vice president. Worked out great, fantastic brother got the job. And the committee said, well, okay, we'll slate you for secretary treasurer. So I ran for secretary treasurer, and I lost again. So it doesn't matter if you lose twice in a district election in the same day. Anything can happen. And just because you get elected or not elected, that doesn't mean that you can't be an effective leader. At least I sure hope it doesn't. Because what did I do after that? I focused on having a wonderful grandmother. And that gentleman right there, he also became a chapter president. That's where I poured my focus and my energy into. I did go to NAPCON the next time around, and I made sure that I continued to try and represent my chapter the best way I could. We'll go on to the next slide. And then by the time I was in grad school and enjoying my second year of grad school, the director of the band had put me on the band staff. I didn't necessarily have any special talents or skill set or anything like that, but I had a passion and wanted to do something, so he said, well, hold a headset and look at folks and see how they're marching and help get them in the right spot on the field. So I said, sure, why not, I'll do it. Just by the fact that I was an old person who'd been around for a while, and because of that, I got to be an unofficial leader in the chapter still. Throughout all this time, the only thing that I was actually doing and the only title I actually had was our ritual chair. I helped make our rituals look good. And that was it. It wasn't elected, just appointed. But for me, the greatest honor that I could have had as a brother is my last year of grad school, when they did the superlatives at the banquet or final banquet or formal that we did that year. They said that, if we're going to vote for someone who is Mr. Kappa Kappa Psi, it's going to be Greg. And for me, that actually meant way more than any formal role that you could have at any point in time. It's about being able to make an impact. That's really all that I ever wanted, and that's all any of us really have to do. To be effective is to have that desire to do something great, to help out folks, to build a chapter, to build whatever it is, and to make your organization great. So let's go to the next slide and I'll wrap up here. Because then I became an alum, and I got to continue doing cool stuff. I got to continue coming back to play with the band. I worked with folks to start up the Southeast District Alumni Association, because we didn't have one in our district. The North Central District Alumni Association, a great one, just started up a couple of years ago, and y'all should join it. Side note. And then, through series of coincidences, spot opens up on the National Alumni Association board. And I get a text from a gentleman named Nick, who is the tall one in the center back of that picture there, and he says, hey, you should really apply for the board. You should apply for the opening. So I did. I was lucky enough and fortunate enough to be selected. And then finally, 10 years after becoming a brother, when we had our elections for the Alumni Association board, I finally won my first election in the Brotherhood. After 10 years. I don't think that meant that I wasn't a leader before then. At least I sure hope that didn't mean that over the past 10 years I never did anything worthy of being called a leader. Because I was there. I was present. And I worked however I could to help make the organization better. So if we'll go to the next slide, what I want you to have as a takeaway is that you can be that transformational sister or brother. You can do whatever it is that is going to make your chapter great. What you have to do, though, is you have to be unabashed in standing up for the values of your organization, standing out for what you believe in, what makes us truly great, what makes us truly special, what makes Tau Beta Sigma and Kappa Kappa Psi unique from any other organization out there of its kind. Something that makes us unique and that we can be proud of, and that we can call ourselves sisters and brothers of this fantastic group that does good things for the brotherhood and for the sisterhood and for our college band. Strongman doubles or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes up short again and again, who spends himself in a worthy cause, who at the best knows, in the end, the triumph of high achievement, and who at the worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly, so that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who neither know victory nor defeat. I believe that we can all be in the arena doing something to make our chapters, our universities great. And if there is one takeaway that I can give you today, it's that that's what I challenge you to do, to go out there and to lead, to dare greatly. Thank you all, North Central District.